Okay, I think we can start. Well, good morning. Welcome everybody to this webinar, Tourism and Air Service Development. As I said, this is organized with our colleagues from ICF, and actually it's the first one of a series of webinars that we are organizing with our world business partner, ICF. In this series of webinars, we are going to address relevant topics to support our airport members to recover the traffic that have been lost during the pandemic. In a broader sense, it will be the main theme of this specific webinar that is going to be led by our colleague Carlos Osores from ICF. He will going to give us an overview of the situation of the industry, and after that he will moderate a panel with experts from either the airport side and the airline side, with the CCOs from Aeris Costa Rica and Nuevo Pudahuel, Mr. Eric Barbosa and Mr. Marc Gordien. And from the airline perspective, Mr. Declan Royan, Executive Chairman of Viva Air. Just before starting with Carlos' presentation, just a couple of remarks I have to say. As you could see, the chat box is not enabled. So for the Q&A session, we recommend and encourage you to send your questions to the email address that you will see in the screen, info@aci-lac.aero, and this question will be addressed in the Q&A session at the end of the panel. And as you could notice, we will have a simultaneous interpretation. In the Zoom menu, you will find a globe icon with the word interpretation. You have to select the channel. In some Zoom versions, it happens that the word of the speaker and the interpreter can overlap, so we will recommend to select the option mute original audio. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Carlos Osores from ICF. Over to you, Carlos.
Francisco, muchas gracias. Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everyone. So yeah, let's set the stage with a brief presentation where we're going to talk about what happened in 2020, how the industry navigated the crisis, what opportunities and challenges we see, and then what the implications are for airports and destinations, which is the focus of this. It's really how to support the traffic recovery. So next slide, please. And the next one. So the next one. So just so we see, just a recap on 2020, how did we end up? So we actually, at the beginning of last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had put out a forecast, and those are the green numbers comparing against the actuals. You know, we were pretty close. We ended the year at about 40% of pre-pandemic traffic in terms of passengers. But then you can see there were some regional variations. Asia performed much better than we anticipated. This is largely due to China, the China domestic market, which was one of the first to recover. In Latin America, you can see the performance was in some sense better than the rest of the world, than most of the rest of the world, with traffic at 42%. But this also has to do with the fact that the pandemic came like a wave, came last to Latin America. And as we'll see later on, it's also perhaps one of the regions that's going to take longest to emerge from the pandemic. Next slide. When we look at what's been happening with capacity and load factors, we see we began the year 2020 in really good shape with capacity above prior year. In fact, we were looking to set historic records for passenger traffic in 2020. And then quickly, everything obviously went against the plan. And you can see that capacity, as you all remember, fell very rapidly year over year. So it slid down to the bottom left. And then towards May, June, we began to climb back from this deep hole. But you can see that the recovery is really in the domestic space, where capacity ended 2020 at about 30% of prior year levels. The international really lagged, still down about 70% of pre-pandemic levels. But the load factors, which is an important consideration, obviously, for airline viability, haven't really been able to penetrate above that 60%, 70% range in the domestic space on a global level, which is really far below where airlines need these load factors to be break even, to have a sustainable business. And then in the case of Latin America, you know, the international traffic within the region is also stuck. Capacity is down about 70%. Load factors are in the mid 50s. And so the long story short is that this is not a sustainable situation, and we are clearly far from a recovery. But there were some encouraging signs. The next slide. Just looking at the global route maps, it's pretty impressive to see how, you know, in towards the worst part of the pandemic in April of last year, you know, most global routes shut down. You had some activity largely concentrated within China and within the US. As I mentioned, China, the recovery began sooner. And in the case of the US, you had subsidies, which effectively obliged the airlines to keep flying. But if you look at South America, it went dark. And then recently, we see all the lights coming back on, the routes coming back. But clearly, in terms of capacity, we're a far cry from where we need the industry to be. Next. So if we look at individual airlines, and this is comparing their capacity now versus last year, we've adjusted the Chinese carriers because they responded to the crisis first. So by March of last year, they were already quite contracted. But you can see the airlines that have recovered the large proportion of their capacity tend to be airlines with large domestic networks, like Volaris, Azul, Aeromexico. In the case of Latin America, they're all at 80% plus of pre-pandemic capacity. The network carriers, LATAM, Gol, Copa, you know, performing much worse. They have significant international exposure, and so those are the markets that we know are lagging. And we see that story, you know, pretty much across the board. In the case of the U.S., the U.S. carriers have recovered much of their capacity, but again, this is because of the government subsidies, which forced them to keep flying in exchange for receiving government aid. And in Europe, you can see Europe is really struggling with the pandemic, border controls, border travel restrictions, and so those airlines are operating a very small proportion of their pre-pandemic capacity. Next slide. Now, in every crisis, there's opportunity, and so there are actually several airlines that have more capacity now than they did prior to the pandemic. And these are those airlines. Most of them you'll see are in Asia. In fact, most of them are in China. But you have some examples in the Americas. You have Viva Aerobus, which is actually larger today than it was before the pandemic. Allegiant in the United States is slightly larger than it was pre-pandemic. And so some airlines are actually seeing this as an opportunity to expand their footprint. Next, please. So if we think back at 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, you know, we were looking at what was without a question the worst crisis this industry has ever had to face. And there was speculation as to how the industry would make it through the crisis, and how many airlines would go bankrupt, et cetera. You know, fortunately, this crisis hit the industry at a time in which the industry was in good financial shape. In some cases, like in the North American market, they've been going through several years of unprecedented profits. And so thanks to the airline industry's strength, there were many fewer bankruptcies and restructurings than we anticipated. So in fact, very few airlines that you've heard of have actually gone out of business. In the Americas, the main one, which, you know, it's just remains to be seen whether they will come back from the pandemic, is Interjet. And then you have several airlines that have gone into Chapter 11. All of the major Latin carriers, you know, LATAM, Aeromexico, Avianca have gone into Chapter 11, but they've succeeded in receiving their financing. And so from that perspective, either there's been receptive governments in the case of North America, in the case of Europe, and in the case of the airlines that I mentioned, the Latin carriers, you know, just receptive capital markets that have helped to avert the worst of the crisis. Next slide. So airlines, what have they been doing to navigate this? We see sort of three types of activities. One is cost control and maximizing liquidity. So airlines have been working very hard to renegotiate leases, to renegotiate labor contracts or concessions, extract concessions from their labor unions. But effectively all contracts across the board have been up for review to try to bring those costs down, both temporarily to withstand this current pandemic, but also to come out of the pandemic with a leaner cost structure. Airlines have also been cutting fleet substantially. In the case, these examples here, airlines have either been accelerating retirements of older aircraft or also parking the larger wide bodies based on the expectation that it's going to take much longer for international demand to come back. And it's obviously very expensive to maintain expensive large assets that are underutilized. So in the case of the US market, for instance, we're expecting it'll take at least 3 to 4 years for the capacity to be back to pre-pandemic, given the number of retirements and given their most recent aircraft commitments, which have been, of course, renegotiated. And then the last pillar that we're seeing is airlines looking for market power through partnerships, through mergers. And there have been several examples of tie-ups that would have appeared unviable prior to the pandemic. So for instance, Azul and LATAM Brazil are co-chairing. They've gone from being direct competitors to being partners. In the case of the North American market, you have JetBlue and American that are now co-chairing out of the Northeast to improve their domestic to international connectivity. In news that affects the Latin America region, also you have Air Europa IAG. This was a deal that had been announced prior to the pandemic. There were questions over the impact on competition that this would have, as there is considerable overlap on routes between Spain and Latin America. But at this point, nobody's thinking about the anti-competitive implications. It's all about survival. So this deal is going through. Next slide. So I think looking ahead, we have lots of reasons to be optimistic. One is the rate of the vaccine development, not just in the speed to get a vaccine, but also in just the sheer number of vaccines that are available now, in addition to treatments. And there are more treatments and vaccines in development. So this is a very important and encouraging sign to support the recovery. The second is government support, primarily in developed markets. In the case of the United States, the government has granted aid equivalent to 25% of the size of the economy, over $5 trillion. And so this is obviously a boom to surviving the crisis, but also to positioning these markets for a faster recovery. In the case of Latin America, we know that there's been a lot less capacity to do this. In Brazil, there's been a quite effective government aid program, but of course that raises concerns over government debt levels and the ability to sustain that and to pay it back after the crisis. And then this feeds into that last element, which is the consumer behavior. Obviously, we all are very eager to go on vacation. So the expectation is that after the pandemic, once we can travel, we will travel. So there's an expectation of a sharp increase in traffic post-pandemic. And then this animal spirits, the issue is that the economy, a lot of this is emotion. And depending on where you are, I can say from the US perspective, there's significant optimism that the economy will grow once the pandemic is over. And so this feeds into the recovery. Now, this is the optimistic side. On the negative side, or the reasons to be cautious, one is the vaccine, the rollouts, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then the efficacy. There's new strains of the virus. We don't yet know how effective the vaccine will be for the new strains that are coming up. And the recovery really right now is underpinned on this expectation that the vaccine will effectively cure COVID and then we can move on. On the government support side, the question is both on the fiscal side, will there be continued support? Of course, the economies are not in good shape. And then you have this notion of how do you actually facilitate the recovery of international traffic by addressing concerns over, have these people been vaccinated? Are they creating a threat or a risk? And so there needs to be a discussion over harmonized travel rules, passports. And then the last part, consumer behavior again. We don't yet know what the implications are of Zoom, how this is going to affect business travel. Likelier than not, it's going to reduce some business travel, but it's really too soon to tell. Also, the notion of working from home, it's a big question mark that's going to have an impact on demand. Next slide, please. So the vaccination part that I mentioned, this is the big concern, is that there's a significant divergence in the rate at which countries are obtaining and rolling out the vaccine. So, the expectation is that in the United States and in Western Europe, we will have achieved herd immunity by the end of this year. Latin America is lagging. Some parts are better than others. Chile obviously stands out as one of the leading examples. But for this to really translate into a recovery, we all need to be immunized as quickly as possible. And of course, this data changes very rapidly. But the point is that Latin America right now is not very well positioned for a quick recovery because of the issues or the challenges with the vaccination. Next slide. So based on this, as we look ahead, our view is that 2021 will be better than last year. The bar was pretty low, but we are on a path slowly to recovery. Our expectation is that we won't return to pre-pandemic levels at the global level until 2023, 2024. Domestic in some markets might come back sooner, or 2022, 2023, and international. Our view is that it'll certainly lag because of the map that I just showed you, so the different speeds of the vaccine rollout, but also having to sort out the travel restrictions and then addressing any potential fears that consumers might have about traveling to other countries. Next slide. And so just to conclude, before we move to the panel, what are the implications for airports? We mentioned we see increased pressure from the airlines to reduce costs. As the airlines need to reduce costs, they need others in the value chain to also support this effort. We see increasing low-cost carrier presence. We've already given some examples of airlines that are really seizing the moment. We had Viva Aerobus, we have Volaris in Mexico, Allegiant, so we see more of this. We also see what we call business model convergence, which has been happening already, but we know that the network carriers, let's take airlines like LATAM, like Avianca, that we know have been going through a transformation process to become leaner. There's more pressure to basically narrow the gap with LCCs. And so we see business models harmonizing, less long-haul demand, less international demand, less business travel potentially, especially in the managed corporates. This may or may not have an impact in Latin America, but we certainly see this having a significant impact in developed markets. A slow and erratic recovery of international. And then this notion of increased friction. Most of you, I think, remember what it was before 9/11 and after 9/11, with the increased physical security controls. Now we foresee additional controls related to health and safety. It's just not clear what those measures will be, how effective they will be, and how they will allow an expeditious return of travel. And so the next slide, just to introduce the panel, you've gotten sort of the consultant view. Now let's hear from the gentlemen that are in the trenches, that are actually dealing with these issues on a day-to-day basis. So we have an excellent panel. As Francisco mentioned, we have Mr. Declan Ryan, who's the executive chairman of Viva Air Group, which is the operator of Viva Air Peru, Viva Air Colombia, and Mr. Eric Barbosa, who's the CCO of Aeris Holdings, the main gateway to Costa Rica, and then Mark Gordian, who is the CCO of the Aeropuerto Arturo Marino Benitez in Santiago, Chile, and formerly of Salvador Bahia. So he brings a perspective from two different markets in the region. So gentlemen, welcome. I think you need to just make sure the mute is off. There we go. Perfect.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today for this panel. So I'm going to ask you a simple question. Start with Declan. Pandemic, challenge or opportunity?
Both. What's the great saying Oscar Wilde said, never let a good crisis go wasted. I totally underestimated it, and I didn't realize Colombia would close down for 6 months. I thought it was another SARS. Great opportunity, to be brief, Carlos, with regard to costs. And I think you see carriers like LATAM, who are very opportunistic in going into Chapter 11 to get their costs right. So the answer is both, in my opinion.
So for an airline like yours, for the low-cost model, where do you see the opportunity?
Primarily with your suppliers and the leasing companies. We've just recently redone a deal with GCAS, and all of our lessors, in fact. And there's some nosebleed deals out there where you can get aircraft at very cheap rates and pay them on an hourly basis, and that's an opportunity.
Okay. How about from the airport side? Maybe start with you, Eric. What do we see? Challenge or opportunity?
A challenging opportunity. And in the sense, we have been able to review all our processes, I mean, from an airport standpoint, in how best to deliver a good service to the few passengers, to the airlines that we are receiving, and that actually puts us in a better position towards the future. Also, the fact that this is going to accelerate what probably has meant the country has been very conservative on the fact of really going into biometric. Now the government is actually looking into that aggressively to put it in the future relatively close. Okay, so that has been also a good thing about this. It's going to take some time. There are processes that have to be reviewed by the government, the AFSIC, immigration and everything, but that really puts us into a new mode instead of going into brick and mortar, going into more efficient processes, as many other countries in the world have done it before. And guess, one of the big things and questions is, what are the new questions that airlines, and here we have Mr. Ryan, is what are the big questions that need to be answered by the airlines, by us to the airlines? What is the information that they need to reactivate the traffic, to reactivate the routes? Although we have been very effective, the country has been very effective in attracting the destinations of being connected again. It has had, there's a new challenge to see what is the new dialogue that we'll have to have with the airlines in the future.
Well, we're going to come back to that question because I think Declan has a long list of requests for airports. So, Mark, what's your take?
Well, in air service development, on a normal basis, we're always working 2 years ahead. So obviously we see opportunities. we are trying always to work on building the new future, and it's been true before the crisis, it's going to be true after the crisis. Now there's been many challenges, frustrations during the crisis. Probably frustrations on at the beginning on how things were managed, maybe the restrictions between countries, and the big challenge that every single government has to make his own receipt. But I think today we have to be a bit patient. I'll take a really good example that I spent most of the time of the pandemic in Brazil, and Brazil has had a fantastic recovery in the domestic market until last February. So really between July and February, the domestic market has recovered a massive amount of traffic, and even though the pandemic was not completely controlled, it was kind of really slow developing in the country, not as it is today. Today that's a bit of a boom, but we saw that as soon as the right measures are in place and that there are less restrictions, people want to fly, and it was all leisure and all VFR. But we've had in Brazil a really good high season, very good summer, and that shows that people are really eager to fly, especially after a 1 year period of strict restrictions. The reality in Chile is a bit different, many more restrictions, so that kind of prevents travel, and it's continuing right now. But we have to be a bit patient. There's some good news down the line. Vaccination process is really fast in Chile, and we are in the top countries in the world that are vaccinating, the rate of vaccination, and we see the light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, we're going to have to look at it from a domestic, regional, and long-haul perspective. Things are very, very different. I think that's going to be the main challenge and the main question we want to address. That a big, large international bodies, ACI, IATA, we will need some really good international coordination to restart. So the vaccination passport, all these things, they will need really good coordination so that we don't fall back into having too many differences between regions and countries.
Right. We're going to get to that wish list in a minute, but going back to the question Eric asked. So since you're being so generous and you want to help the airlines out, what do the airports need to do, Declan, to help bring you back, to bring traffic back?
I don't see us going near Chile or Costa Rica because of the cost. The costs in the airports there are just too high. The international taxes are just too high. So if they want us to come, and we had a really good look at Costa Rica a couple of years ago, but we had to walk away because one of the partners, I think it was Houston Airport Company, is one of the partners there with the concession, just wouldn't move or budge on the airport taxes. So both countries are not cost efficient.
Okay, so there's pressure. I think this goes back to how we ended the deck. There's pressure from the airlines as they're cutting costs, for governments to also respond by making charges lower, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any rebuttals here from the airport side, or because I guess you have your financial challenges too during the pandemic, I assume.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, because airports are high capitals and high cost machines, really, in the normal world.
Yeah, but Mark, what's your net margin? Can I ask the question? What's your net margin for the business?
Yeah, it depends in current times or in the past, but the fact is that the cost control over the airport, I think during the crisis, the airports have been really waking up and trying to make to learn their lessons, etc. I think there are opportunities to restart some markets. Not all countries are equal in terms of taxation and airport charges. A lot of regulation comes into it, and some countries could probably change that in the future. But at the same time, an airport is really something that you cannot really move, and it has to operate. We had this challenge during the crisis. We had to be open and operate, and there is very little, at some point, very little variability to it. So we cannot shut down a flight, for example. So the variable effect of the demand on the airport was terrible during the last year.
But it sounds like you're not going to answer the question about what your net margin is.
Well, this is confidential information, probably, but
well, a lot of these airport groups are publicly quoted.
Yeah. No, but there's no question. But Eric, to your point, though, you said you're investing in automation technology. I mean, is technology part of the solution, part of the answer to making the airports more cost effective and translating those efficiencies to the users?
Well, towards the future, yes. I mean, brick and mortar is expensive. It takes time to build, to plan. So looking into the future about being more effective in all these processes, especially the government processes, which to make them more, let's call it biometric or technology oriented, will really help make the infrastructure that we have today more efficient. Okay. And affect less. A CPE is key. Cost per employment is key to keep it low. We believe to have a long-term, let's say, low CPE is better and is better than really have eventual supports for airlines or etc. Also, one of the things that affects, that in a certain way was mentioned here, is the fact that the government also has some taxation. The government, I mean, government taxation has a weight, but at the same time, we have to admit that governments have needs and they have a fiscal difficult situation. Before pandemic, during pandemic, I mean, in case of Costa Rica, it's just very difficult, and they have to. In that situation is likely not to change, but at least maintain in a continuum and hopefully less be affected by inflation, at least not be affected by inflation. But that's something that the government has to really decide upon into the future.
Okay. And then if we look ahead, what lasting impacts, and again, we'll start again with the airline view, but what lasting impacts do you foresee both for your company and for the industry in Latin America after the pandemic? So what does that new normal look like?
Yeah, I think when it comes to Viva Air, we've become more efficient. We've won a couple of awards for our biosafety, which is unusual for the low-cost guys to be ahead of the Aviancas and the Latams of the world. I'm not overly worried about our future on the basis that most of our traffic is domestic. And I think the key thing here, Carlos, for 21 and probably 22 is going to be domestic tourism. And in Colombia, people love going to the beaches. So I'm quite optimistic about the future. Just one point I would like to make before you move on to the other guys. I'm not too sure, you used the words in the introduction about government support and subsidies and so on, Carlos. I think what's happened in the US is state aid. And that's what the carriers have got. And, that's hard to compete against.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, there's no question that it's state aid. I think nobody hides the fact that it distorts the market. So I think the view is that the aviation is viewed as a public utility that needs to be preserved, that's another debate, but no, it distorts the market. And there's probably other distortions.
It's more terminology I'm focused on rather than what is it.
So, okay, in your case, you see the domestic market's obviously coming back sooner, and a focus on sort of developing domestic tourism. And do you see similar effects? You mentioned Colombia. Do you see similar opportunities in Peru?
Peru is a nightmare. They change governments and presidents every couple of weeks. The recent president made a decision. I love the country, by the way. This has nothing to do with a dislike for Peru. It's a beautiful country, beautiful people. The president made a declaration recently about one of the travel restrictions. And the following day, all the ministers called us up and said, don't worry about that. It's not going to happen in that way. And now they made a decree about a week ago or 2 weeks ago, Carlos, where nobody's allowed to fly over Easter. So they're telling the carriers, you're not allowed to fly over Easter, over the 3 days of Easter, and probably one of the busiest times of the year. So Peru's a nightmare to operate into.
Okay, but when we look beyond the crisis, I guess what I'm trying to hear from you, and I want to get the views from the rest of the panel, is structurally, do we see the industry looking differently after the pandemic?
I certainly do, but I don't want to hog the conversation. I would be very worried if I owned shares in the big boys like Avianca and Lufthansa and so on, because I think there's going to be a fundamental change in business travel and long haul travel.
Eric, what's your perspective?
Okay, we have, one of the good things is that we have, one of the bad things is that we have very small domestic traffic. Obviously, we're a small country. It's mainly, international traffic. 97% is international traffic. What we are definitely, Costa Rica has a great benefit is that it's an O&D touristic market mainly, and few BFR. Okay, 85% of our traffic is mainly that. So what I foresee is that this will take over relatively fast. We are relying on the legacy carriers and on the low-cost carriers, which both have worked a very interesting strategy to really promote new travelers to Costa Rica. Once the legacy carriers were here, they were coming here at nice rates, nice fares. The LCCs brought in us more traffic, and a different kind of traffic, and we have been able to grow significantly in the last 4 or 5 years, and this will help us get this new traffic again. And Costa Rica at this moment, one of the good benefits is that it's not perceived as a massive tourism country. It is it's kind of boutique wise. So people feel nice, and we're open. We just have one small restriction to come in, which is a health pass and security and insurance. And this will and this is making traffic pick up very easily, even after the situation that the U.S. put on the new restriction, and we have really picked up, been picking up little by little in the last a few days to the normal, to the new normal right now of 35-40%. So we have a nice future coming. We are open. We are open, and we are perceiving that it's going to be faster for us than ever. We are very practically connected to all the previous connections to the destinations that we have from Europe and from most of them. Okay. And the airlines are all back again, okay. And at least what they are telling us is that they are, keeping this in the near future, because it's becoming an interesting market to really help, all their travelers, as you mentioned before. This sense of the Americans that are really feeling safe due to all this what's going on right now regarding the vaccination process. They feel this as a safe place to go. And as the new markets open, they begin to come again. We begin to have this traffic. So it's looking good, as long as we are open, as long as the standards, or let's say harmonization, as long as there are no new restrictions at all. Okay, no new norms to come or leave the country.
Okay, so it looks like markets that are focused on tourism, exposure to the U.S., and within reach of both LCCs and full-service carriers are, have a better outlook for the recovery. And what's the view deeper south, Mark? What's the situation in Chile? And what do you see as the lasting impacts there?
I think it's interesting because in 12 months, airports, I'm talking a bit of an overview of the Vinci Airport Group, airports have been taking very seriously the situation and transforming themselves. Of course, there are very large projects. To Chile, we have an expansion project. It's massive, building a massive airport, huge investments, and that took us a bit by surprise. The level of and the strength of this crisis. But again, these are investments for long-term futures, and they remain. But I think airports are transforming, and the industry needs to transform in many aspects. We will not wake up in 6 months' time back to square one, back to the pre-crisis normal we had, both in terms of probably behavior of passengers, demand, but also the players on the market. Players are transforming themselves. Airlines are not the same. You've shown in your presentations, some very large airlines are dropping or cutting their fleet in a massive way. So what the crisis has shown are a bit the limits of our industry. We see we have in large airports the slot question has been a big question. The slot waiver, global slot waiver. We've seen a very strong lobbying to really have a waiver at the beginning of the crisis, which was kind of right, because this was really very, very rapid kind of impact. And on the extensions of these waivers that are lacking a bit of a local understanding. We are very supportive to have an understanding of force majeure, and that there are consequences and some situations that requires really some flexibility. But it's also showing that protecting the slots for a long time. We are not anymore in a very short punctual crisis. We are on a long time crisis. And this was side effects for the next 3, 4, 5 years. Protecting the slots is actually stopping the market or really blocking the market from recovery. We have players that are going to come out of this crisis bigger than they were before, and some very large players that will come smaller. And we should not be too restrictive. Our industry should not be too restrictive on how things should restart. And that's going to be the big question. So we see there's a lot of really good work done in the EU, in the US, China, to address these things, and some with some fair level of some fair frameworks to able to restart after the crisis. But this will be essential. We will need to go through this transformation as a whole industry, because things are not going to be just the same. So that's really a requirement. So we see it. We see airlines. Airlines have been suffering like a lot, and some of them are very resilient. That's more than what we could expect. Very, very resilient. But there are some still a good appetite for some groups to invest in markets in South America. You can tell low cost are ready to invest in various markets, and they're quite aggressive on it. So there are opportunities when we're talking air service development on that side. And really what we want is to limit any kind of industry restrictions that will go against this kind of recovery. So those are very important aspects.
So thanks. I want to talk about the airline structure. So both you and Declan mentioned how the nature of the airlines, especially some of these larger network carriers, having to reshape as they exit the crisis. So we've already seen Avianca pull back. So they've left Peru, and they're basically just a Colombian carrier now, and Central America. But I'm talking about sort of the South America. LATAM remains, and LATAM is effectively now the only pan-South American network carrier. And then you have, excluding Brazil, you have JetSmart carriers, the Viva Air, the Sky. In an environment in which we have less business travel, less international travel, at least for the foreseeable future, is the market big enough to support 3 LCC groups? Do we see consolidation? Do we see appetite for new entrants? What's the temperature?
Yeah. So my point of view is that there are still markets in South America that have not explored the total potential of the demand. Brazil is a really good example. Santiago and Chile has shown that the market could deliver a lot in the last 5 years. It's been incredible, the growth of the LCCs and how the market has picked up. It's impressive. Some countries still have to deliver this. So we're in a region that has not completely had, on a global basis, its low-cost revolution. A lot of people are still not completely traveling. So really, there is potential, and really the focus on leisure, on VFR. If we are looking at a continental-sized country like Brazil, this is massive in terms of potential. So of course, we need to have the right regulation framework. We need to have the right conditions to operate, the right taxation systems, etc. But yes, in terms of demand and potential, there's going to be a post-crisis market in these countries, of course. Yeah.
And what's the airline view, Declan?
Yeah, to answer your question, I think you will see M&A and consolidation throughout the industry, including the low-cost side. I don't think you'll see any new entrants in the South American region. We've been in Colombia now nearly 9 years. I find it funny the way the market talks about Brazil and then it talks about the rest of the region. Brazil is just totally different than the rest of the region, and there is no low cost in Brazil. And maybe the guys in JetSmart who have a lot of money might go in there and so on. But so Brazil is totally a different market, and there's no low cost operations there. And Mark was making the point earlier that there has been great load factors in Brazil, But I would like to also look at how many airplanes are operating now versus had operated in the past. So not to get the data needs to be checked on load factors versus capacity.
Yeah, yeah.
For Brazil.
Yeah, yeah. And there's a few startups that are in the works, but there's lots of question marks around them. You know,
Well, there's loads of lunatics who want to set up airlines. That's for sure. That won't change.
Are you in that group or?
Oh yeah. No, we're on airline number 6. I should have been sanctioned a long time ago, Carlos.
You have the airline bug. No, but I mean, it's. I think we can all agree that once aviation is in your blood, it doesn't
Yeah,
leave.
that's for sure.
There's no cure for this. So, okay, so let's think about the recovery. So how do we bring it back? And since we're sort of going around now to Declan, how do we bring this back? What can we do? We, the collective we, not you as an individual, but as an industry, to make sure that we create the pathway to recovery, the right pathway to recovery.
My answer quickly would be focus on domestic tourism for the next 12 months. I don't think there will be much international tourism, and I appreciate the geographical issues with regard to Costa Rica. I think what's been very interesting recently, Mark, and not just with regard to the sector, but also with regard to Wall Street, is the appetite from the IPOs of Sun Country and Frontier in the US. And you know, their Frontier hasn't been priced yet, but you know, Sun Country went out with an amazing evaluation, and so will Frontier as well. So the recovery will be helped by stronger and better LCCs. I just see shrinkage with the big boys, and in particular the carriers like Avianca and so on.
And what about the government side? I know maybe we can pass to you, Eric, but I want to also make sure we're including these other stakeholders who obviously are part of the equation. What's your view on how to bring things back?
Well, that's probably a very good point. Not probably, it's a good point. One of the things is harmonization. We have been, it is key. Nowadays, if I look at the Facebook that we have at the airport, I mean, we have continuous questions about what are the requirements for coming from this country, from the other country, okay? And there's pretty much confusion. So rather, many of them, you know, rather probably don't have a hassle. So the harmonization is key to have that. It's going to take time. I don't know how many years it took after 9/11, you know, to kind of get everything. It was a different thing, but that's important. I guess IATA, ACI, World Trade Organization, etc. All these have to work with the governments on that. Second, and looking at the industry as a whole, you know, Costa Rica has done a great job, especially as we open, and we opened on November 1st, and we have not closed since then. And it seems to be very, it's paying off. It's paying off. The Minister of Tourism, the Minister of Health, and the country as a whole, we have been looking at the benefits of that. And the airlines are really, you know, feel comfortable, you know, putting their planes where they don't see a risk of any situation of coming back. So if I were to concentrate in one thing, is that harmonization, or two things: harmonization and reliability on the country of not opening and closing borders for reasons. If there's a big risk, okay, that's a different thing. But the country has been successful in that term, and the airlines have said it. Have mentioned it to us just recently. Yesterday, I had a conversation with an airline that they're putting more seats because of that.
Oh, that makes sense, and I think predictability and stability are key for customers to feel confident booking in advance and planning in advance. So, excellent. Now you, Mark, I know you talked about the health passports. What do we need to do to bring it back?
Yeah, I think I had a bit two perspective on that. Like regional leisure market in Brazil was super happy because the recovery was fast. It took 6 months to recover almost 90% of traffic, and it was all domestic. So domestic definitely has legs in the recovery, and a lot of the demand for international is going to come into domestic. So when things are stable inside the country, when vaccination is passed and the country has reached a certain level of protection, I don't know if it's going to be called immunity, but protection, very hopeful that domestic is coming back stronger, really, with also taking some demand that cannot travel internationally. And Brazil has shown it, so it's working. When things are okay, demand is picking up. International, as I said, extremely complex because of local restrictions that are sometimes very difficult to read. They are difficult to read for us. We are working in the industry, and sometimes we have no clue how to travel from one country to another. It's extremely difficult, and I cannot imagine for my parents or someone who is a bit less. it's difficult. It's becoming a huge challenge to travel. So that really bad. The vaccination is good news. Obviously, everyone is really going for it, accelerating, and that's good news for the industry. But as I said, we need a really good harmonization. It's a bit a cry for help for international organizations. We really almost an obligation of result, because without a vaccination health passport that is recognized in various regions, in various countries, that will remain very hard. And vaccination needs to be really a fast track into a country. So if you are flying from the US into Europe with your vaccine, you should be able to enter almost under normal conditions, and not having an additional layer of vaccine plus quarantine plus test plus. We need to remove some of these restrictions that are obviously they're understandable, of course, from a health perspective. It's normal for countries to protect their population. It's all normal. But in the recovery phase with vaccination, we need really to have something that works on a global scale. And that has been the challenge at the beginning of the crisis. That will remain the challenge right now.
So how many of the three of you, just to vote, how many do you think that vaccination passports are sort of a must for the new normal for international travel? Is that something that you think has to happen?
In the current situation, not sure there is another solution. I'm not sure there's really a much better solution.
What do you guys think, Eric and Declan? Do you see this as part of like the new normal, or?
That's a good question. I would say yes. Look what happened with fiebre amarilla
Yellow fever?
to South America. It's the same situation. Once you get that approved, then you start looking at the traffic. But also I see more the different regulations. I mean, if countries ask for different stuff along the way. It's not only the vaccination. It's a series of things that have been invented recently, so to speak. The quarantine, for example. I mean, that's a killer for our industry. So and look, I mean, they asked for for example, I think it was Holland or Amsterdam. Holland was asking for a test 4 hours before the flight, aside from the PCR test, and all these events have to. Is it vaccination alone? Well, hopefully yes, but it has to clear all the way. All other restrictions have to be cleared out to really see this going on. It's a challenge. It's a public responsibility. The governments have their public responsibility, and I don't mean to go against that, but I mean to speak clearly and be monochromatic on that in a certain way. Yes, I mean it has to. I mean, if you go with that, you have to clear the rest.
Got it. Declan, do you think you'll have a health passport in your future?
I don't know. And I'm not avoiding the answer. I wrote down maybe.
Maybe? Okay, that's a good one.
No. Just it creates a pile of questions, Carlos. What would it look like? And I totally agree with the guys about harmonization. In Europe here, we have this nuts situation where we have 27 states.
Yeah.
So during the ash cloud crisis, we had 27 different opinions of what ash is. So. It depends.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience, and they're asking, and I guess this goes to the airports. Maybe this is a question for Mark, given the airport's profile. Should airports continue to be dependent of corporate travel?
Be dependent or independent?
Dependent. So should airports still be depending on catering to corporate travel?
Well, airports are a gateway for any any type of demand.
Yeah.
And there's one thing that is interesting. We have, the airports have a different range of services for passengers. So commercial services, food, beverage, retail, and also hospitality services, VIP lounge, etc. What airport? I mean, talking about many Santiago, also the VNC airport group, so we've seen a massive transformation on the commercial side. We have changed completely the way we are working with our tenants, and today it really, if we have managed our costs, we also manage how our revenue is working, and we are sharing but much more the risk of traffic with our tenants. So having all these services that are nice services, some passengers really segments are asking for these services is great, but we are also being mindful to work in partnership with the tenants that are earning these services, and that we are all trapped in the same situation as us, and the whole chain has been suffering through the same type of consequences during the crisis.
Okay. Listen, I think we're about to wrap up. Just to conclude, I think there's some key themes that came out of this. One is that the challenge, the pandemic does present opportunities to come out as a leaner, better business. We heard from the perspective of the airline, this is a chance to improve the cost structure. From the airport side, this is a chance to improve and invest in technology and automation. For the recovery, looks like harmonization is a key word that has come up a lot. You know, just make sure that, you know, Declan mentioned this example of sort of this decisions being made in Peru that are sort of inconsistent with prior practices in the country, but that are also inconsistent with what's happening in other countries. So the idea that for traffic to recover, you know, the industry really needs to have one voice, and obviously let the airlines and the airports be part of the formulation of that voice. So it's not imposed on you, but it's something that comes from within and that you buy into. And then in terms of the recovery, it looks like there's consensus over the domestic market being and the leisure markets being those first to recover. And that's a wrap. So I want to thank the three of you for joining. Hopefully we won't be having too many more webinars. At some point, we hope that we can actually start to see each other face to face and share a caipirinha or something like that, or some aguardiente, and just toast to the recovery. But again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Carlos.
It's been great.
Thank you, Carlos. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you to the audience and ACI, Francisco.
Thank you, Carlos, well, for the wrapping, and we really want to appreciate and thanks our panelists for taking the time for this presentation. Thank you. And as in the previous webinar, you will receive later today, well, the presentation and the recording of this webinar. Thank you for all of you for your participation, and see you next time, next webinar. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.